You know, I was picking on Rand Paul yesterday. Let's go over Rand Paul for just a minute, okay? Rand Paul has been the big voice of integrity. We promised repeal. Why don't we repeal? Let's go back into the Wayback Machine for a minute. 6 months ago, right? 7 months? January. In January, the Senate had to pass certain budget regulations or budget resolution that would begin the repeal process. Okay, every senator was for this because there was no political consequences at the time. Every senator was for it except Rand Paul. Okay, so this is the first. Let me get my cut list. This is the first Rand Paul cut, number 3.
As a physician, probably nobody is offended by or is against Obamacare more than myself. I've seen it up close. I've seen it firsthand. I'll do anything to get rid of it. However, I don't want to have to vote for a budget that never balances and a budget that adds $9.7 trillion in debt in order to get to it. What I've told my colleagues is, why don't we introduce a good budget, one that balances, right, and then repeal Obamacare? The way the rules of the Senate and the Congress are, you cannot repeal it until you pass a budget. But why does it have to be a bad budget?
Okay, so the one senator, he was not for it. He wasn't going to do what needed to be done to pass Obamacare to pass repeal of Obamacare because the budget just wasn't good enough. Okay, then 3 months ago, they started talking about just repealing it. And Rand Paul, that was no good. It had to be repeal and replace. Here's the second cut. This is 3 months ago.
Well, actually, I don't want to delay the repeal. I'm all for the repeal as soon as we can get to it, but we should vote on replacement the same day. And I'm putting together a bill that'll be out this week that will be a consensus replacement bill.
Okay, now they bring in repeal and replace, and it's just not good enough for Rand Paul. This is right before the vote collapsed.
Well, you know what I've suggested to the president, and I talked to the president again, when he was in Paris just this last weekend, or I guess on Friday. And I've told him, I think we can still, if this comes to an impasse, I think if the president jumps into the fray and says, look, guys, you promised to repeal it. Let's just repeal what we can agree to. And then we can continue to try to fix, replace, or whatever afterwards.
So it's never any good. And every time he speaks, it's always, I want repeal more than anybody else, but, and the old expression, everything that comes before but is nonsense, right? I want repeal, but it's never good enough. And all I get is, yes, no, you attack Rand Paul, but he's a man of principle. He's a man of principle. Now, here's Jonah Goldberg, one of the smartest political observers out there, in my opinion, from National Review. And he is no anti-Rand Paul guy, and he's always very reasonable about Paul's positions. And he says, I found many. He asks the question, is Paul really operating on principle? Here's what Jonah says. I found many of Paul's arguments and complaints entirely persuasive on the merits. But there have been times when I had to wonder if the merits were all that was driving him. Was it just a coincidence that the bill was terribly unpopular in his home state of Kentucky, where more than 1 in 5 Kentuckians are on Medicaid? Now, that's the big cut. That's the big reform. Everybody who was for the bill kept saying this is the biggest reform basically in a quarter century, if not more, and the reform was on Medicaid. So 1 in 5 of his constituents are on Medicaid. And Goldberg goes on, this is the problem. When touting your principles is a politically expedient way of avoiding accountability, it's hard to tell whether principles or expedience is in the driver's seat. But it's not impossible to tell. Paul learned politics on the knee of his father, Ron Paul, a longtime Texas congressman and irrepressible presidential candidate. In the House, the elder Paul earned the nickname Dr. No because he voted against nearly everything on the grounds that it wasn't constitutional or libertarian enough. But Ron Paul loved earmarks. This is where you put in stuff in a budget that's going to go right to your constituents so that you can brag about all you got for them. Ron Paul would cram pork for his district into must-pass spending bills like an overstuffed burrito. And then he would vote against the bill in the name of purity, often boasting that he never approved an earmark or a spending bill. So in other words, he knew the bill had to pass, he'd stuff it full of earmarks, then he'd vote against it because it had earmarks in it, knowing it would still pass. In 2006, Republicans proposed legislation to slow the growth of entitlements by $40 billion over 5 years. Democrats, as usual, screamed bloody murder about Republican heartlessness and voted against it. So did Ron Paul on the grounds the reform didn't go far enough. $40 billion cuts. He votes against it because it didn't go far enough. And Jonah adds, man, that sounds familiar. Now, I can't say for sure, this is Jonah again, that Rand Paul is carrying on the family tradition. He is different from his dad in many ways, and yet every time healthcare proceedings moved one step in Paul's direction, he seemed to move one step back. Senator Ted Cruz offered an amendment that would open up the market for more flexible and affordable plans like Paul wanted. No good, Paul told Fox's Chris Wallace. Those plans would still be in the context of the Obamacare mandates. My idea always was to replace it with freedom, legalize choice, legalize inexpensive insurance, allow people to join associations to buy their insurance, Paul said, which sounds good, except a provision for exempting associations from Obamacare mandates was already in the bill. What are you trying to get? What can you get? Those are the questions you got to know. You got to know what you can get and what you want to get and what the path is to getting what you can. And if Ron Paul is always against everything, he can bang his chest and say he's for principles, but essentially he is doing nothing.